So I have been putting off this video long enough. I've been procrastinating because to me, this is a very important video. And I realized that it doesn't make sense for me to talk about sword techniques, my experiences in sparring, my experience in sword fighting, without first talking about what I'm using for sparring. So essentially, I need to make this video because I really needed to have a understanding between you and me and anyone watching, right, about what is it that we've derived the knowledge from, and how am I using it, what am I doing in terms of when we start your sparring videos, what am I using, right? I haven't said, oh, it's a bamboo sword, it's super light. It's not super light. This sparring sword was originally designed by teacher James Guo many years ago. So I don't take any credit for his design. My only modification is that I think I improved certain materials, and I played with weight and balance a little bit. The design originally was, I believe, invented almost nearly 20 years ago. It's been a long time. So I've been fighting with this for probably a better part of 15 years now. So the key design advantage of this is that we have the two bamboo strips that we've taken apart from the kendo shinai. So you can have two pieces of bamboo across the side, right? And these are essentially, you can consider your blade. And these are the part that strikes the target. And they create a fairly interesting sound. And when you strike the arm, it imparts a strike. It leaves a mark. But because of the internal foam, it absorbs the vibration and a little bit of the strike. So it does not allow the force to go into the bone. So you get some superficial bruises, but it doesn't leave permanent injury. And that's essentially the goal. The goal of the weapon is not to remove pain completely. It essentially is to make it safe enough that your injuries are not permanent. You still want to have a little bit of pain. You still want to have a sense of danger and fear of the weapon. And with the fear of the weapon, then that's when you can develop proper attitude and proper technique and proper body control and distancing. One of the distinct advantages of this design is it is much more realistic to simulate blade-on-blade contact, because swords are made of metal. They're not exactly made of foam. So when you make contact with them, the edge of themselves do not really cushion any impact, right? So when you're trying to move your power within the handle, what happens is that particular pressure will directly go into the other person's weapon as you manipulate it. If you have foam on the outside, well, one, the friction is totally wrong, and the feeling you would not be able to impart the same kind of friction, the same kind of force into the enemy. And other is that there's a very wide range you can get between a very crappy foam sword to a very realistic metal sparring sword, right? Between that range, though, you can have something like this, which is much cheaper to produce. So this thing, I've made it, I think probably cost me somewhere around 10 to 20 bucks in raw material. But the only thing that really costs you is the time. The most time consuming part of it is really the handle wrapping. That takes like hours to do. Other than that, everything else is fairly straightforward. So in the beginning, the swords this is one of the earliest ones I've made, and the same material still lasted all the years, although the foam is, as you can see, very beat up. In the beginning, the inner core, so those foams are not very dense, and because of that, they're very light in weight. So this sword it absorbs impact quite well. It hurts a bit, on the as you strike, the material is a bit hard, but because it absorbs all the impact internally, no force, very little force goes into the arm, and so it doesn't really hurt. It won't hurt the bone essentially, but because of the lightness of it, we practice with it. We learn to be fairly fast with it. They are not super light. They're light, but they're not as light as you think. Online, there's a video from many years ago, and I think lots of people have seen them since then. And I think a lot of the message was like, wow, the sword looks super light. It's like, yeah, it is very light. We learned to be very fast with it. It taught us to have extremely fast reflexes. The thing is, it's not as light as you think. We've also learned to impart force with it fairly well. but it is a bit too light compared to a real sword, because a real sword will approach somewhere around 2 pounds in terms of weight, and this is, I believe it's like barely half a pound, somewhere like less than 1 pound, a lot, maybe less than 0.8 of a pound. So this is a lot lighter than a real sword, and that's one of the things that I changed about this particular design in the beginning, was that how do I increase the weight without making it more dangerous in sparring. The construction, my changes, my contribution to this particular design is that I've changed the inner foam core to be a multi-composite material. So essentially the part 1/3 of the foam close to the body essentially is replaced with a dense expansion foam. So this foam is a lot denser than the old impact foam that was used before. And what that does is greatly increases the weight of the weapon. And while I retain the lighter foam on the top 1/3 of the weapon, so that it can still retain the impact absorbency when you have that kind of strike at the edge. And the end of the sword is installed with a rubber stopper. The rubber stopper essentially can be removed, like for example. But what this does is also just in case of like an accidental hits from the end of the weapon. So the idea of the weapon really is, to be safe and yet retain the rigidity of the blade, such that when you bind with the blade, you can properly learn the dynamics of how to use it. It's great to have wooden swords, and wooden swords will have pretty good binding feeling that it can impart in terms of impact. But the problem is that if you hit hard enough and fast enough with full force of wooden swords, you might get injured permanently, right? And so the goal of this weapon is to be, one, we want to retain all the good stuff, all the good things that comes with a realistic training tool, while still be economically viable and safe. Especially now, a lot of people do HEMA, or other armored combat. Sort of armor costs a lot, and a really good weapon cost a lot. You have no replacement of the realisticness of it. But at the same time, though, you gotta remind yourself that not everybody can afford that, right? So essentially, when you put everything together, you would have. So this is a sparring sword I've used for a long time now. This is actually more than 10 years. It's been gone through multiple number of repairs, so it's pretty beat up, even after the new wrappings of the new tape. So the handle shape, as you can see, this is sort of the shape of the handle I prefer. I've changed the wooden handle design from the past with a heavy impact plastic, and this is the same material as the cutting board you get for the kitchen. The same kind of plastic. And so because of that, it used to be the old problem was that after certain hits in sparring, the guard will simply crack and fall apart with enough number of sparring cards. And as you can see, we can really go really hard with this weapon without fearing of too permanent of an injury. And so with this kind of plastic, this thing has been holding up for like a decade now, and just really have no sign of breaking ever. What I want to say about this really is that it's important to choose your weapon when you practice, because with the right design, you can learn a skill, but with the wrong design, you actually will go in the wrong direction when you develop your skill. In the sense that when you have, for example, swords, right, you got to think about what are you trying to learn from it. What is the binding blade control? How can I approximate, real weapon metal-to-metal contact in a safe and effective manner? And one thing I've learned about, for example, in a lot of martial arts, it really is about intensity. They can bring it. If you can bring the 100% intensity, then you're going to learn what is it like to control your body and your weapon at that speed. And it's something that a lot of people it's hard to appreciate that for people who only do forms and people who only do drills, right? It's when you're actually in combat at full 100% intensity, you learn something about speed and control, and that you otherwise you can't really quite learn. So I've have these custom made, these wooden sparring swords, and they're great. They're extremely good quality, and I've asked the maker to make it as heavy as they can, and this is made of hickory, right, with Purple Heart as its base. And the weight of this, plus a little bit of extra weight inside of the guard and a handle, this comes out to be 1.3 pounds. And so with a wooden, and you don't want to actually, so this is a fairly stiff blade. It works great for binding training, but you don't really want to strike each other without any protection with the sword because it would dent your bow, right? You might very well crack something. Whereas for this sword, the weight is about 1.1, 1.2 pounds. It was only about a little bit lighter than this particular sword, and yet it is much safer to fight with. So I just want to clarify with this video that in the future sparring videos where we're using these swords to fight, I know that people will simply say, oh, look, it's a bamboo sword, looks too light. It's not too light. It's 90% or 95% the weight of a sparring grade wooden sword, right? And be able to fight with this, as soon as you switch into, a slightly heavier weapon, let's say 1.3 pounds for a light Chinese metal sword, a real sword, you can be fairly confident that I can control it, right? Use it in some substantial way. Of course, it's not a 100% replacement, but it gets you to where you want to go in terms of that about 80%, I would say, 80 to 85, almost 90% of where you want to go in terms of the weight of the sword, in terms of control. And there's rest of 20%, I would say, of real metal binding, that, yes, we have to learn, that you have to experience, right? But other than that, I say this will get you pretty far. And so the bang for the buck for this weapon is pretty good. So this allows you to do safe sparring with minimum protection and not without worrying about permanent injuries. And it doesn't take away the pain, of course, but it teaches you a lot about weapon dynamics and weapon binding and blade control. And this has been our secret weapon, I would say, for the past decade now. But here you can hear first. You hear first here on YouTube, and that we're opening up and letting you know that you can make a sparring sword this way, put the foam in the middle, and have a reasonable material like bamboo on the two edges, and you can get a pretty good sparring grade for less than $50.